The crystal palace of Emperor Kalthmore stood like a mountain of glass on the planet Zenthara Prime. Its walls reached so high that clouds formed around the upper levels. Inside these walls lived the most powerful ruler in the galaxy, commanding an empire that spread across thousands of worlds. But for 3 long years something had been wrong in this palace of power. Every night a sound echoed through the corridors that made even the bravest guards shake with fear. It was crying, but not from any ordinary creature. The sound came from Vorthak, the Emperor's dragon, a beast so large that he could swallow a spaceship whole. His tears were the size of human fists, and they fell like rain onto the crystal floor of his chamber. Vorthak had been the Emperor's most treasured possession for over 50 years. The dragon was older than most civilizations, with scales that sparkled like liquid starlight and eyes that glowed like golden suns. He was the last of his kind, a creature from the ancient days when dragons ruled the stars. The Emperor had found him as a young dragon and raised him in the palace. Vorthak had been his companion, his weapon, and his symbol of power. But 3 years ago everything changed. The Emperor's only son, Prince Zelthmore, had died in a battle on the edge of the Empire. The young prince had been leading a war against rebel forces when his ship was destroyed. The Emperor mourned for months, but eventually his grief turned to anger and then to cold determination. He had an empire to rule, and showing weakness was not an option. Vorthak, however, could not move on. The dragon had loved the prince like a brother. When the news of the prince's death reached the palace, Vorthak had let out a roar that shattered every window in the capital city. Then he had curled up in the corner of his chamber and began to cry. He had been crying every night since. The Emperor had tried everything to stop the dragon's tears. He brought in the best healers from across the galaxy. They examined Vorthak with their strange machines and gave him medicines that could cure any disease. Nothing worked. He called for the Empire's greatest mystics, wise beings who could speak to the minds of animals and understand their deepest thoughts. They spent days with Vorthak, but the dragon would not respond to their efforts. Beast tamers came from the wild worlds where giant creatures roamed free. They knew how to calm the most dangerous animals, but Vorthak was beyond their skills. The Emperor even brought in entertainers, hoping that music or dancing might distract the dragon from his sorrow. Vorthak simply closed his golden eyes and continued to weep. The dragon's crying was becoming a problem for the entire palace. No one could sleep through the mournful wails that started every evening and continued until dawn. The Emperor's advisors begged him to do something. Some suggested moving Vorthak to a distant moon where his cries would not disturb anyone. Others whispered that perhaps it was time to put the dragon out of his misery, but the Emperor could not bear the thought of losing Vorthak too. The dragon was his last connection to better times, to the days when his son was alive and the future seemed bright. So he endured the sleepless nights and the complaints from his court. He posted guards around Vorthak's chamber and forbade anyone from entering without permission. Deep beneath the main levels of the palace, in the service tunnels where pipes carried water and cables carried power, lived the workers who kept the great building functioning. They were mostly slaves from conquered worlds, people who had been captured during the Empire's many wars. These workers rarely saw the upper levels of the palace, and the nobles above rarely thought about them. Among these forgotten people was Katie Walsh, a young human woman with brown hair and tired eyes. She had been 23 when the Empire's ships arrived at Earth 5 years ago. The war had been brief and brutal. Earth's defenses were no match for the Zephyrian fleet. Cities burned, and millions died or were taken as slaves. Katie had been working as a teacher in a small town when the invasion came. She had tried to protect her students, but there was nothing anyone could do against the alien weapons. She watched her world fall, saw her family die, and then found herself in chains on a transport ship heading for the stars. Now she spent her days crawling through narrow tunnels, fixing broken pipes and replacing burned-out circuits. Her hands were always dirty, and her back ached from squeezing through spaces meant for maintenance robots. But she was alive, and she had learned that sometimes being alive was enough. Katie had heard about the dragons crying from the other workers. The sound traveled through the palace's walls and reached even the deepest levels. At first, she had been frightened like everyone else. Dragons were creatures of legend on Earth, monsters from old stories. But as the nights passed and the crying continued, Katie began to feel something different. She recognized the sound for what it was, It was not the roar of a monster or the cry of a wild beast. It was the sound of someone who had lost everything and could not find a way to go on. Katie knew that feeling well. She had made similar sounds in the early days after Earth fell, when the pain of loss was so great that it felt like her chest might burst. One evening, as Katie was finishing her work in a tunnel near the dragon's chamber, she heard the Emperor's voice echoing through the ventilation system. He was speaking to his advisors, and his words were full of desperation. "I will grant any wish to whoever can stop Vorthak's crying," the Emperor declared. "Freedom, wealth, power, anything they desire. I cannot bear this any longer." Katie stopped working and listened. The Emperor's advisors murmured among themselves, but none of them had any new ideas. They had tried everything they could think of, and nothing had worked. The dragon continued to cry, and the Emperor continued to suffer. That night, as Katie lay on her thin mattress in the workers' quarters, she made a decision that would change her life forever. She would try to help the dragon, not because she hoped for a reward, but because she understood what it meant to grieve alone in the darkness. Katie reached under her mattress and pulled out a small, battered harmonica. It was the only thing she had left from Earth, a gift from her grandfather before he died. The metal was scratched and some of the notes were off-key, but it still played. It was her most precious possession, her last connection to home. Tomorrow night she would find a way to reach the dragon's chamber. She would sit with Vorthak and see if a grieving human could help a grieving dragon find some peace. The next evening, Katie waited until the other workers were asleep before making her move. She knew the palace's service tunnels better than anyone after 5 years of crawling through them every day. There was a maintenance shaft that led up to the level where Vorthak's chamber was located, and she had mapped out a route that would avoid the main corridors where guards patrolled. Katie tucked her harmonica into her pocket and began the dangerous journey upward. The shaft was barely wide enough for her shoulders, and she had to use her hands and feet to grip the metal rungs that lined the walls. Her heart pounded as she climbed, not from the physical effort, but from fear of what would happen if she was caught. Slaves were not allowed in the upper levels of the palace. The punishment for being found where she did not belong would be severe, but Katie pushed aside her fear and focused on the sound that drifted down from above. Vorthak was crying again, his mournful wails echoing through the crystal walls. After 20 minutes of careful climbing, Katie reached the maintenance panel that opened onto the dragon's level. She pressed her ear to the metal and listened for the sound of footsteps. The corridor beyond was silent except for Vorthak's crying. The guards had learned to stay away from the dragon's chamber at night, unable to bear the sound of his grief. Katie carefully opened the panel and slipped into the hallway. The walls here were made of the same crystal as the rest of the palace, but they glowed with a soft blue light that came from within the stone itself. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, and Katie could see her reflection looking small and out of place in this grand setting. She followed the sound of crying down the corridor until she reached a massive door made of silver metal. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, and it was sealed with locks that she could not understand. But there was a smaller door beside it, meant for servants who brought food to the dragon. This door was not locked, though few had reason to use it anymore. Vorthak had not eaten in weeks. Katie took a deep breath and pushed open the servant's door. Beyond it was an airlock chamber, a small room with another door on the far side. She stepped inside and sealed the first door behind her, then opened the second door and entered Vorthak's chamber. The room was enormous, larger than any building Katie had ever seen on Earth. The ceiling was a dome of crystal that showed the stars beyond, and the walls curved away into shadows. In the center of the chamber was Vorthak, and Katie gasped when she saw him. The dragon was even more magnificent than the stories had described. He was the size of a small spaceship, with scales that seemed to capture and reflect the starlight from above. His wings were folded against his sides, but Katie could see that they would span the entire chamber if he spread them wide. His neck was long and graceful, ending in a head that was both beautiful and terrible. But what struck Katie most was how sad he looked. Vorthak was curled in the corner of the chamber like a hurt animal, his great head resting on his front claws. His golden eyes were closed, and tears the size of Katie's fist rolled down his face and fell to the crystal floor with soft splashing sounds. For a moment, Katie could not move. She had expected to feel fear when she saw the dragon, but instead she felt overwhelming sadness. Here was a creature who had lived for thousands of years, who had seen empires rise and fall, who had once soared between the stars. Now he was trapped in grief so deep that he could not even lift his head. Katie took a step forward, then another. Her footsteps echoed in the vast chamber, and Vorthak's eyes opened. Those golden orbs focused on her, and Katie felt as if she was being examined by something ancient and wise. The dragon did not move, but his crying stopped. "Hello," Katie said softly. Her voice sounded tiny in the enormous room. "I'm Katie, I came to sit with you." Vorthak tilted his head slightly, watching her with curious eyes. Katie walked slowly across the chamber until she was close enough to touch the dragon's nearest claw. It was as large as her entire body, but she was not afraid. She could see intelligence in Vorthak's gaze and sadness that matched her own. Katie sat down on the crystal floor beside the dragon's massive paw. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself as small as possible. For several minutes, neither of them moved. Katie simply sat with Vorthak, sharing the silence and the sadness. "I know what it's like," Katie said finally, "to lose someone you love, to feel like the world ended, but somehow you're still here." Vorthak's eyes fixed on her face, and Katie felt as if he was really listening. She began to talk, telling the dragon about her life on Earth, about her family and friends who had died in the war. She told him about her brother Danny, who had been her best friend and protector. Danny had died defending their town, and Katie had watched him fall. "People kept telling me I had to move on," Katie said. "They said Danny would want me to be happy, that I couldn't grieve forever, but they didn't understand. It's not that I wanted to stay sad. I just didn't know how to be anything else." As she spoke, Katie pulled out her harmonica. The metal was warm from being in her pocket, and it felt familiar in her hands. She held it up so Vorthak could see it. "My grandfather gave this to me before he died," she explained. "He taught me to play when I was little. Music was how our family shared feelings when words weren't enough." Katie put the harmonica to her lips and began to play. The melody was slow and soft, a song her grandfather had called Going Home. It was about missing someone who was far away, about the hope of seeing them again someday. The notes echoed in the crystal chamber, creating a gentle harmony that seemed to wrap around both Katie and the dragon. As she played, something wonderful happened. Vorthak began to hum along. The sound came from deep in his chest, a low rumbling that matched the tune Katie was playing. His voice was like distant thunder, but gentle and warm. Together, they created a song that was both sad and beautiful. When the song ended, Vorthak lowered his great head until it was resting on the floor beside Katie. She reached out and placed her small hand on the warm scales of his snout. The dragon's eyes closed, and for the first time in 3 years, the chamber was completely silent. No more tears fell, no more crying echoed through the palace. Katie stayed with Vorthak until the first light of dawn began to filter through the crystal dome above. The dragon had fallen into peaceful sleep, his breathing slow and steady. Katie carefully stood up, not wanting to wake him, and made her way back to the servant's door. As she prepared to leave, Katie looked back at the sleeping dragon. Something had changed between them in those hours of shared silence and music. She did not know what would happen next, but she knew that neither of them was alone anymore. High above in his private chambers, Emperor Kalthmor stood at his window, staring down at the dragon's chamber through the crystal floor. For the first time in 3 years, his palace was quiet. His advisors would be amazed when they discovered what had happened. A simple human slave had accomplished what all their wisdom and power could not. The emperor watched as Katie disappeared through the servant's door, and he made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow he would summon this remarkable human and learn how she had worked such a miracle. Katie had barely returned to her sleeping quarters when the summons came. 2 imperial guards, tall aliens with blue skin and silver armor, appeared at the workers' level just as the morning shift was beginning. Their presence caused panic among the slaves, who scattered like frightened animals. Guards never came to the lower levels unless someone was in serious trouble. The human called Katie Walsh, one of the guards announced in the common language used throughout the empire. "The emperor commands your presence." Katie's fellow workers stared at her in shock and fear. Being summoned by the emperor could mean only one thing: death. No slave had ever been called to the upper levels and returned. Katie's hands shook as she stood up, but she tried to keep her face calm. She had known this moment would come when she decided to visit Vorthak. The guards led her through corridors she had never seen before, past rooms filled with treasures from 1,000 conquered worlds. The walls were covered with paintings that moved like windows, showing scenes of distant planets and strange creatures. Katie tried to memorize everything she saw, knowing these might be the last beautiful things she would ever witness. Finally, they reached the throne room, a chamber so vast that Katie could barely see the far walls. The ceiling was a dome of pure crystal that showed the sky above, where 3 suns cast rainbow patterns across the polished floor. At the center of the room stood a throne made from a single piece of black stone, and sitting upon it was Emperor Calth himself. The Emperor was not what Katie had expected. She had imagined a monster, a creature of pure evil who had destroyed her world without thought. Instead, she saw a being who looked tired and old, despite his obvious power. His skin was pale blue like his guards, but it had a gray tint that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. His eyes were silver, and they studied Katie with sharp intelligence. Around the throne stood dozens of the Emperor's advisors, all dressed in flowing robes of different colors. They whispered among themselves as Katie was brought forward, their voices creating a sound like wind through leaves. Many of them looked angry or confused, unable to understand why their emperor would waste time with a human slave. "Approach," the Emperor commanded, his voice echoing through the great chamber. Katie walked forward on unsteady legs until she stood at the base of the throne's steps. She had been told by other slaves that she should bow when meeting the Emperor, but something inside her refused to kneel. Instead, she stood straight and looked up at the most powerful being in the galaxy. "You are the one called Katie Walsh," the Emperor said. It was not a question. "Yes," Katie replied simply. A murmur went through the assembled advisors. They had expected her to grovel, to beg for mercy or proclaim her unworthiness. Her simple, direct answer surprised them. "Last night my dragon stopped crying for the first time in 3 years," the Emperor continued. "My guards report that you entered his chamber without permission. Tell me what you did." Katie took a deep breath. She could lie, try to make up some story that might save her life, but she had never been good at lying, and she suspected the Emperor would see through any deception. "I sat with him," she said. "I talked to him about losing someone you love. I played music for him." The throne room erupted in shocked whispers. The advisors could not believe that something so simple had solved a problem that had plagued them for years. Some of them looked angry, as if Katie had somehow cheated by not using complex magic or advanced technology. "Silence," the Emperor commanded, and the room immediately became quiet. He leaned forward on his throne, studying Katie with intense interest. "You sat with him. Nothing more? Sometimes that's all someone needs when they're hurting," Katie said. "Someone to be there with them, to show them they're not alone." One of the advisors, an elderly alien with purple skin and elaborate robes, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, this is ridiculous. A mere human cannot understand the complex emotional needs of a creature like Vorthak. There must be some trick, some deception." The Emperor raised his hand for silence, but his eyes never left Katie's face. "In my empire, I command the loyalty of billions of beings across thousands of worlds. I have armies that could destroy entire star systems. I have wealth beyond measure and power that spans the galaxy. Yet this simple human accomplished what none of my experts could do. How do you explain this?" Katie thought carefully before answering. She knew her words could determine whether she lived or died, but she also knew she had to speak the truth. "Maybe it's because I understand what Vorthak is feeling," she said. "I've lost people I loved too. When my world was conquered, I lost my family, my friends, everything I cared about. I know what it's like to hurt so much that you think it might kill you." The Emperor's expression changed slightly, and Katie thought she saw a flicker of pain cross his features. She realized that for all his power, he was also someone who had lost a loved one. The death of his son had hurt him just as much as it had hurt Vorthak. "The dragon was grieving," Katie continued. "He needed someone to grieve with him, not someone trying to fix him or make him stop feeling sad. Sometimes you have to feel the sadness completely before you can start to heal." The throne room was completely silent now. Even the advisors had stopped their whispering. Katie's words had touched something in all of them, a recognition of loss that crossed the boundaries between species. The Emperor stood up from his throne and walked down the steps until he was standing directly in front of Katie. Up close, she could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes and the way his shoulders sagged with the weight of responsibility. "You asked for nothing in return," he said quietly. "You risked punishment, even death, to comfort a creature you had never met. Why? Because no one should have to suffer alone, Katie replied. The Emperor stared at her for a long moment, then turned to address his advisors. I made a promise that whoever stopped Vorthak's crying would receive their greatest desire. What do you want, human? Freedom? Wealth? A ship to return to your homeworld? Katie had thought about this moment during her long walk to the throne room. She could ask for her freedom, demand to be sent back to Earth. But Earth was a broken world now, and she had no family left to return to. She could ask for wealth or power, but those things had never mattered to her. I want to stay with Vorthak, she said, surprising everyone in the room. He's not done grieving yet. Healing takes time, and he shouldn't have to go through it alone. The advisors exploded in angry protests. The idea of giving a human slave a position of honor in the palace was unthinkable. Some of them demanded that Katie be executed for her presumption, but the Emperor raised his hand for silence, and slowly the room became quiet again. He studied Katie's face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motive. All he saw was genuine concern for a grieving dragon. Very well, he said finally. You will be appointed as Vorthak's caretaker. You will be given quarters near his chamber and everything you need to tend to his welfare. But understand this, human. If he begins crying again, if you fail in this responsibility, the consequences will be severe. Katie nodded, accepting both the honor and the danger that came with it. As the guards prepared to escort her to her new home, she felt a mix of fear and hope. She had saved Vorthak from one night of sorrow, but the real work of healing was just beginning. The Emperor watched her go, wondering what he had just set in motion. A human slave now held one of the most important positions in his palace, caring for his most treasured possession. His advisors thought he had made a mistake, but something told him that Katie Walsh might teach them all something about the true nature of strength and compassion. Katie's new quarters were unlike anything she had ever imagined. Instead of the cramped sleeping area she had shared with dozens of other workers, she now had 3 rooms of her own, with walls of crystal that could be made transparent or opaque with the touch of a button. There was a bed softer than clouds, a bathing room with water that stayed perfectly warm, and a sitting area with chairs that adjusted to fit her human body. But the most amazing thing was the wall that looked directly into Vorthak's chamber. Katie could watch the dragon at all times, and he could see her as well. The wall could be made solid for privacy, but Katie kept it clear. She wanted Vorthak to know that he was not alone. The first few days were challenging. Many of the palace servants resented Katie's sudden rise from slave to honored caretaker. They whispered behind her back and made her meals late or forgotten entirely. Some of the nobles were even worse, barely hiding their disgust that a human had been given such an important position. But Katie ignored the hostility and focused on Vorthak. Every morning she would enter his chamber and sit with him while he ate his breakfast. Enormous portions of specially prepared meat and fruits from across the galaxy. In the evenings, she would play her harmonica and tell him stories about Earth, about the seasons changing and the way rain sounded on human rooftops. Slowly, Vorthak began to respond. At first, he would only hum along when Katie played music. Then he started making soft rumbling sounds when she spoke, as if he was trying to join the conversation. After a week, something extraordinary happened. Vorthak spoke to her, not with words but with thoughts placed directly into her mind. The first time it happened, Katie was so startled that she dropped her harmonica. One moment she was sitting quietly beside the dragon, and the next moment she heard a voice in her head, deep and warm like distant thunder. "Thank you," the voice said, and Katie knew without doubt that it was Vorthak speaking to her. "You can talk," Katie said aloud, then felt foolish. Of course he could talk. He was ancient and wise, older than human civilization. "I have not spoken to anyone in many years." Vorthak's voice came again in her mind. "The Emperor's people can hear my thoughts if I let them, but they do not listen with their hearts. You are different." From that day forward, Katie and Vorthak talked every day. The dragon shared stories of his long life, of worlds he had seen born and stars he had watched die. He told her about the early days of the Empire, when he was young and the current emperor was just a child. He had watched Prince Zelthmore grow up, had been his companion and protector. "He was like a son to me as well," Vorthak explained. "When he died, I felt as if part of my soul had been torn away." Katie understood. She told Vorthak about her brother Danny, about how his death had left a hole in her heart that she thought would never heal. They grieved together, sharing memories of those they had lost and slowly learning that love did not end with death. As the weeks passed, something wonderful began to happen. Vorthak started to show interest in the world again. He asked Katie questions about human culture, fascinated by the way humans formed bonds that crossed family lines and social ranks. The concept of friendship, of choosing to care for someone not because of duty or hierarchy but simply because you valued them as a person, was something new to him. In the Empire, all relationships are based on power, Vorthak told her. The strong command, the weak obey, but you humans have something different. You choose to love. Katie introduced Vorthak to human music, teaching him songs from different cultures and time periods. She sang lullabies her mother had taught her, folk songs that told stories of heroes and ordinary people, and even some of the popular music she had enjoyed before the invasion. Vorthak learned to harmonize with his deep, rumbling voice, creating music that was unlike anything ever heard in the palace. Their friendship did not go unnoticed. The Emperor had hidden cameras in Vorthak's chamber, and he watched the growing bond between human and dragon with fascination and growing concern. His empire was built on the principle that some beings were naturally superior to others, that the strong had the right to rule the weak. But here was his greatest treasure, a creature of immense power and ancient wisdom, treating a human slave as an equal. The Emperor's concern turned to alarm when reports came in from the outer systems. Several colonies were in rebellion, and the Empire's forces were struggling to maintain control. For the first time in decades, the Emperor needed Vorthak's help in battle. Dragons like Vorthak were living weapons, capable of destroying entire fleets with their breath and tearing apart space stations with their claws. But when the Emperor summoned Vorthak to the throne room and commanded him to join the war, the dragon refused. "I will not fight," Vorthak declared, his mental voice reaching everyone in the chamber. "I will not kill for the Empire anymore." The Emperor was stunned. In all their years together, Vorthak had never refused a direct command. "You will obey me," the Emperor said, his voice harsh with anger and desperation. "I am your master." "No," Vorthak replied simply. "I am not a weapon. I am a person." The word person sent shockwaves through the assembled court. For Vorthak to claim personhood was to reject the fundamental structure of the Empire itself. If a dragon could be a person, then what about other enslaved beings? What about humans like Katie? The Emperor's advisors demanded immediate action. Some suggested forcing Vorthak to obey through torture or threats. Others recommended finding a way to control his mind directly. But the Emperor knew that such methods would only destroy the dragon's spirit, making him useless as a weapon and companion. In his desperation, the Emperor made a decision that would change everything. He summoned Katie to the throne room and issued an ultimatum that he hoped would force Vorthak back into submission. "Your human pet has taught my dragon dangerous ideas," the Emperor announced when Katie stood before him. "She has filled his head with notions of equality and choice that threaten the stability of my empire. Therefore I give Vorthak a choice. Return to your duties as my weapon or watch as I execute the human who has corrupted you." The throne room fell silent as the weight of the Emperor's words sank in. He was gambling that Vorthak's attachment to Katie would override his newfound principles. If the dragon cared more about protecting his friend than maintaining his independence, he would submit to save her life. But Katie spoke before Vorthak could respond, her voice clear and strong in the vast chamber. "He's not a weapon," she said, repeating the words that Vorthak had used. "He's a person, and people shouldn't be forced to hurt others just because someone more powerful tells them to." Her words echoed in the crystal dome above, seeming to hang in the air like a challenge to everything the Empire stood for. The Emperor realized that his plan had backfired. Instead of forcing Vorthak to submit, Katie's courage was inspiring the dragon to even greater resistance. In his chamber below, Vorthak felt something stir within him that had been dormant for centuries. It was the memory of what it meant to choose, to stand up for what was right regardless of the consequences. Katie had reminded him that true strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the courage to protect and the wisdom to know when fighting was wrong. The Emperor saw the determination in both Katie's eyes and Vorthak's golden gaze, and he knew that he had lost more than just a weapon. He had lost the illusion that power alone could command loyalty and love. The Emperor's threat hung in the air like a sword ready to fall. Katie stood in the center of the throne room, surrounded by hostile aliens who saw her as nothing more than a troublesome slave. But she was not afraid. Her friendship with Vorthak had taught her something important. Some things were worth dying for. You have 1 hour to decide, the Emperor told Vorthak through the communication system that connected the throne room to the dragon's chamber. Submit to my will or your human friend dies. But Vorthak's response was not what anyone expected. Instead of submitting or pleading for Katie's life, the ancient dragon did something that shook the very foundations of the palace. He reached out with his mind, not just to Katie or the Emperor, but to every intelligent being within 1,000 miles. His telepathic voice touched the minds of slaves working in the deepest tunnels, guards standing at their posts, servants preparing meals in the kitchens, and nobles discussing politics in their private chambers. Even the Emperor's advisors, protected by mental shields, felt the power of Vorthak's thoughts breaking through their defenses. I am Vorthak, the dragon's voice announced to every mind it touched. For centuries I have been a weapon for this empire, helping to conquer worlds and enslave entire species. I thought I had no choice, that obedience was the only path available to me. But a human named Katie taught me something that changed everything. We all have choices, even when those choices seem impossible. In the throne room, the Emperor's face went pale. He could feel Vorthak's message spreading through the palace like wildfire, reaching beings who had never dared to dream of freedom. I choose to be free, Vorthak continued. I choose to refuse to be a weapon. I choose to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And I call upon every enslaved being in this empire to make the same choice. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Throughout the palace, slaves stopped working and stood up straight for the first time in years. Guards looked at each other with new understanding, realizing that they too were prisoners in a system that valued only power. Even some of the nobles began to question the foundation of their privileged lives. In the throne room, chaos erupted. The Emperor's advisors shouted commands demanding that the guards arrest Katie and seal off Vorthak's chamber. But their orders fell on deaf ears. The guards were too busy listening to the dragon's words, too amazed by the possibility of choice to follow orders blindly. You cannot do this, the Emperor said, his voice carried by speakers to Vorthak's chamber. You will destroy everything we have built. What you have built is built on suffering, Vorthak replied, his mental voice now reaching across the planet and beyond, touching the minds of dragons on other worlds who had been enslaved just as he had been. It is time to build something better. Katie felt Vorthak's presence in her mind, warm and protective. Are you ready to leave this place? He asked her. Where would we go? Katie asked, speaking aloud so that everyone in the throne room could hear her side of the conversation. Anywhere we choose, Vorthak replied. The galaxy is vast and there are worlds where beings like us can live free. But Katie surprised everyone, including Vorthak, with her response. I don't want to just escape. What about all the others? What about the humans still enslaved on Earth and 100 other worlds? What about the aliens who have been conquered and forced to serve? We can't just save ourselves and leave them behind. Her words reached beyond the palace, carried by Vorthak's telepathic broadcast to every corner of the empire. On distant worlds, enslaved beings lifted their heads and dared to hope. On rebellious colonies, freedom fighters heard a message that gave them new courage. The Emperor realized that his empire was crumbling around him. The very foundation of his power, the belief that some beings were naturally superior to others, was being challenged by a human slave and a dragon who had chosen to be free. Stop this, he commanded, his voice desperate. I order you to stop, but his orders had no power now. Vorthak was already breaking free from the chamber that had been his prison for so many years. The crystal walls cracked and shattered as the dragon spread his wings for the first time in decades. The sound of breaking crystal echoed through the palace like thunder. Katie ran from the throne room as the Emperor's guards tried to grab her. But Vorthak's supporters among the palace staff helped her escape, opening doors and blocking corridors. She reached the dragon's chamber just as he burst through the ceiling, sending shards of crystal raining down like stars. Vorthak lowered his great head to Katie, and she climbed onto his neck without hesitation. Together they rose through the broken ceiling and into the sky above the palace. Katie had never flown before, and the sensation was incredible. The wind rushed past her face as they soared higher and higher, until the palace looked like a toy below them. But they were not alone in the sky. Other dragons, inspired by Vorthak's call to freedom, were breaking out of their own prisons across the planet. Some had been kept in hidden chambers beneath the palace. Others had been chained in military bases or private collections. All of them were taking to the air, their voices joining Vorthak's in a song of liberation that echoed across the stars. From space, the effect was even more dramatic. Vorthak's telepathic message reached dragons on other worlds, and they too began to break free. The Empire's greatest weapons were turning against their masters, not with violence but with the simple act of refusing to obey. On the surface, the Emperor stood in his ruined throne room, watching his power crumble. His advisors fled or turned against him, and his guards threw down their weapons. The slaves he had taken for granted were walking away from their posts, no longer willing to serve a system that denied their humanity. High above the chaos, Katie and Vorthak flew toward the edge of the planet's atmosphere. They were not fleeing, but leading. Behind them came a growing army of dragons, former slaves, and even some former nobles who had chosen freedom over privilege. "Where are we going?" Katie asked, her voice carried to Vorthak's mind despite the roar of the wind. "To the outer colonies," Vorthak replied. "To the worlds where rebellion is already stirring. We will show them that freedom is possible, that even the mightiest empire can fall when enough beings choose to stand together." Katie pulled out her harmonica and began to play, the melody carried by the wind to the dragons flying beside them. One by one, they joined in with their voices, creating a song that could be heard across the vacuum of space. It was a song of hope, of courage, and of the revolutionary idea that all thinking beings deserve to be free. As they flew toward the stars, Katie thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a broken slave, mourning the loss of everything she had ever loved. But in helping a grieving dragon find peace, she had discovered something powerful. Compassion could change the world. Behind them, the Empire continued to collapse as more and more beings chose freedom over servitude. The rebellion spread from world to world not through violence but through the simple act of refusing to accept oppression. It would take years to build something better in place of the Empire, but the foundation had been laid by a human and a dragon, who dared to believe that friendship was stronger than fear. In the depths of space, Katie played her grandfather's harmonica while riding on the back of an ancient dragon, leading a revolution that would echo through the galaxy for generations to come. The small metal instrument that had once been her only connection to home had become a symbol of hope for countless worlds. The alien emperor's dragon no longer cried every night. Instead, he sang songs of freedom with a human friend who had taught him that even the most impossible dreams could come true when beings chose to stand together against injustice. Their story would be told on 1,000 worlds, inspiring others to believe that ordinary people could change the universe through the simple act of choosing compassion over cruelty, love over power, and freedom over fear.